The BBC reported a competitive education system and an elitist curriculum do not help address the underachievement of white working class pupils, MPs have heard. And this was tweeted out by me during the week, and a certain Desmond Deehan, who is CEO head of Odyssey Trust, and we'll come to that later, tweeted in response, "So a group of university academics explain why elitist universities have put off white working class boys. As a white working class boy, I certainly find them off-putting." So over to you, Desmond. Tell me, what's it like being a white working class boy?
Yeah, I should probably qualify that. I think the boy thing is somewhat in the past. There's only so many words you can put on tweets, so I couldn't explain that. But as somebody who grew up as a white working class boy, I suppose is what the tweet should say. I'm clearly neither a boy or probably somebody who would argue working class anymore. But yeah, I think it's one of those messages that you read and you think, I can't bite my lip on this one. And obviously, I haven't read the data from the research from the academics within it. But I think what came out strongly from that was the irony of university academics lecturing on what the white working class are put off by or encouraged by. And there seems a sort of massive disconnect between their world and the world that they're referring to. Illustrated by the very fact that they could make that kind of statement, that in somehow going to university or universities themselves are off-putting. And although I said that actually I find them off-putting, I didn't find university off-putting quite clearly, because I went to university myself, and at no point did I find the idea of them being elitist in any way off-putting. In fact, probably the opposite. That's what I was aspiring to do, and I have no reason to believe I'm exceptional in that respect. And I think that's probably what's missing from that debate. I think what underpins that is the fact that we are treating the white working class as some kind of homogeneous group, which has specific characteristics which follow that model, and there's a single culture within that. And I think that's incredibly naive and probably patronizing as well.
That's a very important point. I mean, obviously, it was a committee reporting to Parliament, and therefore it wasn't just one view being expressed, and there was a range of views that were expressed at the time. So it's worth looking in more detail at that. But going back to what you said there, which I think is really interesting, is the homogeneity of the white working class. And the idea that university or something is beyond them because they're white working class people. But there is something to be said. If we look at the figures, the white working class, it seems, do not exactly overachieve at school. In fact, they underachieve. So what do you think might be the reasons for that?
Well, I think you can't get away from, first of all, that problem that we've determined that they are a group to be identified, and they're identified partly by their underachievement. So all of those who tick a box that qualifies them as white working class get treated into one lump sum within that, and it hides all the variations that are within it. So it's telling us what we've actually set it up to tell us about just achievement and just this group that we've determined. If we had subgroups within that, it would probably tell us something else. And although it's in no way the same, it does resonate a little bit with the current debate about BAME as an identifier and the issues that actually there's a range of variation within that. And if you split that up, you would get a much more sophisticated understanding. Having said that, there's no doubt that amongst those who underachieve at school, those who would be put within the white working class bracket certainly are significant in terms of that underachievement. But I think if you're not clear about who's in that group first, you can't really make many useful statements about what the causes will be, because the causes are different for different members of those groups. There is no single thing. I think the problem I find is because we've defined it as the white working class, that therefore is also we're defining that as being the problem. that they are underachieving because they are white working class, that there is something fundamentally flawed or problem for the white working class to overcome in order then to be achieving. So it becomes a circular argument in that respect. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's Matthew Goodwin, who's the professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent, told the committee, apparently, terms such as toxic masculinity and white privilege could become more of a problem as we send yet another signal to these communities that they are a problem. So being white and working class is the problem. Now, we're waiting for Desmond to jump back there. Did you hear the end of that? Sorry.
I just got the they are part.
They are, right. So did you get the toxic masculinity, white privilege bit? Yeah. So they are the problem. So sorry that we send yet another signal to the white working class community, and we're questioning that they are a problem. So we're identifying all the time that the whiteness is a problem, that the masculinity is a problem for the boys side of things, obviously. Are we trying to just find problems where there aren't any?
To some extent, yeah. I think part of the first issue is deciding with this group that there is a problem with them, that we somehow, or the liberal academic elite, have to somehow solve, is in itself part of the problem. To think that the white working class are reading The Guardian or The Times and concerning themselves about terms like toxic masculinity and white privilege is in itself an issue in terms of the understanding of the white working class. This isn't terminology that I'm sure is being bandied around fairly liberally amongst the white working class, although they may have issues around the identification or support for particular groups. For a start, I think we have to ask, does the white working class identify itself as a group of white working class in the same way that we are identifying other ethnic minority groups? Do they see themselves as being part of a group which is somehow hard done by attention to other groups? And I'm not sure that's clear that is the case. I'm not sure that they self-identify in that way. The identity has been put on them by, unfortunately, these fairly left-leaning middle-class academics who are a world away from that existence within that, despite any research that might be there. So I think the first thing is determining what are we basing that on? Are the white working class telling us that they're put off by universities because they're elite and they're put off by toxic masculinity and white privilege? I very much doubt that they are. I'm not even entirely certain they've even been asked.
Right. When we get to elitist academics and elitist academe, is there such a thing? Is academia elitist? Are we talking about certain subjects? So I'll pick at random, not quite, but Latin. Is Latin suitable for the working class and the white working class for that matter? I'd
probably flip the question around and ask, why wouldn't it be? It depends very much on what you want to. Well, first of all, are you treating a group as having education because it serves a particular purpose? So employment, the old factory model, and I think part of the argument still stem from that understanding of education, that we're not equipping them. They don't need Latin because they're not going to use Latin in any particular job they're going to do. So what's the point? But we don't teach Latin because it's useful necessarily. Not in the work or vocational sense. So deciding for a start what subjects are suitable and which aren't is in itself part of the problem. Why should there be any distinction between what a working class boy and somebody from any other group would study in school? Why shouldn't they be available to study both if they choose to do so? Because in itself, we're already beginning to segregate by deciding that there are certain courses for certain groups and certain courses for others. So that in itself, I think, is a problem. I don't think that it's the subjects or the curriculum or the content that's the issue. And again, part of our problem, I think, with education is we sometimes treat education in isolation as a bubble. And it isn't. It's part of a society, and that society changes, and that society has impacts and influences on the groups that engaged in our education. So if we want to, if you say, improve the outcomes for the white working class, we can't just do it within schools or within the curriculum or what's taught. It actually also includes that larger cultural context. And that's why a more sophisticated understanding is important, because do we know what those contexts are? If I give an example, within that white working class, you first of all have to determine, do we actually have, are these working class, or are they not working class? So there are some who have not experienced employment or any meaningful employment within their family for some time, compared to somebody who's actually been working. There's first a bit about that, but whether they're working or not. And then there are subgroups within that. So for instance, do we include settled traveller communities within that white working class category? And if so, that's a very different cultural context and very different challenges within that, and a very different perception of education as well. And I think that's why it comes back to that original problem of, if we treat them as a group, do we therefore have to treat them differently as a group? And do we treat them in isolation in education, or do we have to consider the wider societal issues that impact upon that? And I think, yes, so go ahead, Martin.
No, I suppose people talk about our kids at our school, won't get that or won't understand that. I mean, certainly when it comes down to choice of what to put in the curriculum, let's say at exam time, perhaps you could choose certain texts, and you say, well, I don't know if our kids can quite deal with that. Is that something that is reasonable for a school to think, or for teachers to think as they choose texts?
I think it's pretty dangerous. I think what you choose to put into the curriculum, the text, for instance, needs to have some relevance so that it can be accessible. But if you make it too accessible and there's no stretch, then you're not really providing much of an education. So, for instance, just giving boys adventure stories or boy-orientated literature is actually preventing them from experiencing something else. And then we are actually starting to manage their education without having them full participation. Having said that, having a range and diversity and making it accessible, and that sometimes is around scaffolding. You may not go straight into Jane Eyre. You may begin with something else first and scaffold into that, so they have some framework and understanding to engage with it.
Yeah, I suppose if at GCSE you're already saying our kids can't cope with a certain text, then you're admitting failure from what you taught before the GCSE, perhaps.
Yeah, it's no different, I think, than historically, where curriculum decisions were made about particular groups of students in schools that actually channeled them into particular careers or outcomes. You're never going to get a chance to do this, therefore we're going to teach you woodwork. There's no point you learning this, because actually you're not going to get any jobs in that and you're not going to be successful in it. I don't think it's our place to make those decisions for them. I think it's our place to overcome those barriers that they might be experiencing, aside from where they are. So, and don't we do that for every other group of students? When they enter schools, don't we begin with some kind of assessment of their previous performance, whether they have any SEN needs, etc. And don't we put in then scaffolding and support and interventions? We don't decide that SEN students have to have a completely different curriculum because they're SEN. We try to actually make it possible for them to access the full curriculum wherever that's possible, by actually putting in the support that they need. Why would we treat any other group differently from that? That becomes social engineering. Right.
How did you end up as a white working class boy where you've ended up now, which is in charge of 2 schools and speaking on national TV, and I don't mean this, by the way, on national TV as an expert in your field. How did you end up there? What's your journey from the early? Was it in Wales? Was it?
It was in Wales as well. So an added obstacle to overcome, possibly, Martin. My apologies to everybody in Wales, but the reality is, I suppose, so I'm the youngest of 6 children from a working class family. And 2 of us went to university, me and my older sister. So I suppose in terms of a statistic, it's not a great outturn for a whole group of children only 2 out of the 6, a third have actually gone through to university, but actually that's pretty good. And therefore, I clearly did a path that was very different to my siblings. Having said that, even while I was studying my A-levels, I still had a burning passion to become a painter and decorator like my brother. And I think that's one of the aspects about that background and that understanding. That actually, you're working within a norm, and our human behavior is to go towards the norm. You know, what's everybody that you know doing? Who what's your family? What does your family do? What are their aspirations? What are their ambitions? Who's successful in your sphere, and who do you therefore emulate? Now, if that's doctors and lawyers and engineers, then you're going to emulate those. There's no surprise that actually the majority of people who train to be doctors come from some sort of background where there are doctors in the family. There shouldn't be any different if actually your family are in construction or building or other occupations, that you should want to do the same possibly. So there was a fair degree of anchor into staying where I was and doing well within that framework. The difference was having been inspired by the education that I received, which was by no means a gold standard education, but I never felt at any point that I was being given an education that was relevant to me and my background. We didn't leave out Shakespeare because I wouldn't cope with Shakespeare. So we did Hamlet, and that was my first sort of Shakespeare. Actually, no, Twelfth Night was my first Shakespeare. And I loved Hamlet. Went to the theatre and saw Hamlet, saw Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, was inspired by that. Did literature, did D.H. Lawrence. Actually, no reason why particularly D.H. Lawrence would be relevant to me. But having access to that gave me the opportunity to do so. Now, having said that, lots of my classmates didn't follow the same path and went into their own routes within that. But by restricting that, by deciding that the curriculum I was going to have was going to be relevant to my background, I would never have had the opportunity to engage with it. And maybe I am one out of however many that did so, but that one is important. My fear about trying to manipulate education and curriculum around this supposed homogeneous group is those students who actually are capable of moving beyond that group into something else that isn't necessarily the norm, don't get the chance to do so because they've already been lumped in to that. And I think that's my fear.
I suppose also tying the idea that painting and decorating is reading Hamlet or D.H. Lawrence is not suitable for a painter and decorator is a strange thing to think as well. It's not just about the content of the curriculum and where you end up. After all, the curriculum is beyond the idea of jobs, after all, isn't it?
Yeah, in no way did I ever receive any guidance about the kind of job I would go into. That says an awful lot about the quality of careers guidance at the time that I was in school. But nothing I was doing educationally was to equip me for a particular kind of role or profession. But what it did give me was a hunger for learning and an enjoyment and engagement with that, which materialized into what I'm doing now. There was no pathway in this at all. It's a series of decisions made because certain opportunities were available and you had the chance to make those decisions. And it could have easily been something else.
Yeah, and you're in a unique position, I think, as a trust CEO. I need to say CEO. I was going to say head, but it's a CEO, the correct term, I think. You have the two schools, one of which, and I think your first school is a girls' grammar school, and the other one is a co-ed secondary modern school. Now, is this slightly against what you've been talking about, in that it could be argued, I'm not saying I'm arguing this, but it could be argued that you have the grammar school, which is the school for the middle class and the achievers, and the secondary modern for the working class, those who are going to end up sweeping the streets, perhaps?
I think if you were still within a sort of 1950s framework, that might actually be an argument. I think certainly it's true that grammar schools now are dominated by middle classes still to a large extent. And there's various circumstances. I think in no way is that by design. I think that's by default, because you have 163 grammar schools in the entire country, not regionally distributed. So geography determines it. And then when you've got geography, those people who are more affluent and have more resources will actually work the system better to get their children into them and also aspire to them. And that's a challenge for grammar schools to overcome that. And one way is by making the grammar schools more accessible to working class children. But that means those working class children have to pass a selective test in the first place to get into them, because you can't really get around that aspect. The other way, and I think that first way is great, and we've done a lot within the grammar school to improve our access in that respect by making pupil premium, for instance, a high priority. But the other way actually is by engaging with the other schools, the secondary moderns, and working with them in partnership, because there's absolutely no reason why the opportunities that are provided at the grammar school shouldn't be available to the students in the secondary modern. But to do that, you need a grammar school and a secondary modern not throwing stones at each other over the fence, but actually working together. And one way you do that is by setting up a trust with those two schools and putting a passionate working class boy in charge of it as the CEO, to ensure that that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So in effect, actually, it's entirely the direction. It's entirely what I said, because yes, there is. I don't think there necessarily is one system, one school setup, which will provide all of that as easily as perhaps you can do by actually schools working together in combination and providing the relevant opportunities. Within that, there are students who don't want to study Latin and don't want to go to university and be a professor, and you have to provide that opportunity as well. But it shouldn't be a default position. And I think what we've tried to do with the Odyssey Trust is ensure that there is no default position. There is no preordained path for you. You have the opportunities to pursue whichever one of them.
Yeah. What I'm interested in there, because it seems that you've set up a trust which is comprehensive, but within that comprehensive trust, you still have a selective system. And I just wonder there, do you provide a different curriculum in both schools, one for those perhaps who haven't or won't achieve as well as those in the other school, or is it purely the same curriculum in both, and the same opportunities in both, which then makes me wonder why two schools?
Right. Yeah, I think there's a number of answers to that. One is that currently the curriculum isn't identical across the two, and that's partly because we're in our second year of the trust, so it's about establishing and building this over time. What we do have is exactly the same school day. We do have a very interesting slot which supports character education and development and wider skills, and it's called the 21C curriculum, Martin, which might resonate with you. And that's the same in both. But no, the curriculum offer isn't exactly the same yet. But over time, the vision is to bring that closer and closer together. So yeah, why couldn't we just do this in one large comprehensive school? Well, all you have to do is look at the experience of comprehensive schools so far. It's not there. Comprehensive schools haven't become that. Some of the very best have managed to do that, but it's by no means universal around it. Therefore, those opportunities don't necessarily exist simply because you put everybody into the same school. And you're talking about significant numbers of students as well. You have to have sometimes different pastoral structures to support them, because the level of need at the secondary modern school is far higher than that at the grammar school. That means a different pastoral structure, much greater support around SEN and inclusion because of the population that's there, because you have a much bigger range. But you also have very able students at that school who, for one reason or another, didn't get deemed selective and didn't go to the grammar school. And it may well be, and I accept this argument, that not everybody reaches their selective ability at the same time. And I think that's a fair point. And it might be that they come into their own in year 8 or year 9. Normally, in the current system, that would be it for them. Depending on the quality of their school, they might actually get greater support and greater opportunity, but then again, they might not, because education tends to work towards the middle more. In this system, they can get identified through the trust and provide opportunities for them to get those greater opportunities, and also potentially to go on to study the A levels that might not be available in their individual school, and stay within that fold within it. I don't think in any way that this is the one size fits all system, and I wouldn't advocate that. I think that's part of the problem, is assuming that there is a one size fits all system. If we just got that and everything was comprehensive, for instance, then we would have solved everything. We won't. The diversity is part of the key, in the same way that treating the working class as one comprehensive group that covers all is flawed. It's wrong to treat education in the same way.
And it's not just done on the 11 plus, of course, because the other part of your grammar school is that it's girls only. Is that right?
It's boys in the sixth form. So it's girls from year 7 to 11, and then a significant number of boys join us in the sixth form provision.
So if a boy is in the secondary modern school and shows more potential at the age of, you were saying perhaps year 8, year 9, so 12, 13 years old, how do they access a more grammar school education? Is it through sharing lessons or sharing teachers, or how does it work?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I probably would qualify when we say a grammar school education, because I think there are certain assumptions about what that is. Effectively, it's just a good education with probably a significant amount of extracurricular in there, and some probably on balance, generally more specialist teaching. There are exceptions to that. What they would be able to access through this process is the access to some of the extracurricular activities that could be supported from both schools, that would not necessarily be easily accessible, or there'd be too few numbers to make them viable at the secondary modern. They get what is probably the most important bit, is the quality of teaching, that we have a CPD training program which ensures that we have the very best teachers in both schools. And sometimes I know certainly secondary moderns and sometimes comprehensive certain sectors struggle to recruit high quality staff, particularly in very specialist subjects or core subjects like maths and science and English. So, for instance, we have 2 of our grammar school staff seconded to the secondary modern to provide some of that support until such time we get to the point where we can actually recruit better and better teachers within there. And a team of lead practitioners, which work in the secondary modern as well. So part of it is making sure the quality of teaching is right, and doing that by supporting through teachers from the grammar school as well, particularly in those subject areas. I think the other bit is about progression. It's not so much just around year 7, 8, and year 9, but certainly by the time they get into exam groups and GCSE and A level, to have that choice of subjects, because you have those subject specialists, particularly by the time you get to A level, where it's hard enough to get good physics teachers as it stands. But if you're in a school where you only have 3 students who may potentially go on to do A level physics, it's really hard to justify it economically as well. We have previously, what we've done is we've taken students from the secondary modern into the grammar school sixth form. They've stayed on roll at the secondary modern, but they've been taught in the grammar school for their A levels, enabling them to do the subjects which otherwise just wouldn't be available to them, and providing that support, and allowing the secondary modern school to have its wider post-16 offer that serves the much wider community that they have.
Wow, it's a fascinating story, yours. Before we reach the end of the interview, can you tell me how is your school coping with COVID? Right.
Yeah, that's the new phrase, isn't it? I suppose I'd say we're coping. So across the 2 schools, what we've done largely is built in a fair amount of flexibility into how we operate, so that because the situation changes fairly frequently, being able to pivot quite quickly from one direction to the other. But we have the idea of bubbles is fairly challenging, because you can't actually have particularly small bubbles. But we so far have, I think across our schools, we've only had about 30 odd students that have had to go home because of somebody testing positive. It's only a matter of time. I know some of my neighbours here in the area have had a lot more and it's an inevitability. So we're running effectively. I mean, I kind of think I've got 2 schools. In fact, I've got 3 schools because I've got the virtual school as well. And I think lots of head teachers are experiencing this fact that actually I thought I was running 1 school, now I've got 2. I've got to have this virtual one running at the same time as the other one for the students who can't be present in the school, and also run this one as well. On the plus side, what it taught us, and I think it taught lots of other head teachers as well, is that when you want to go for a virtual curriculum and more IT focused, network focused education, you can do it pretty quickly when you have to. If you're planning it, it would take probably 2 years in the planning and the implementation, and everything would have changed. We had 2 days, I think, as with every other school, to suddenly have up an online curriculum that was worthy of the name. And it's still a work in progress. And I probably would say that as the whole COVID, coping with it, it's a work in progress. Yeah, what's happening today could be very different next week. But I think we've got used to that. I think schools very much are orientated around stability. You have timetables, you have bells. Monday one week is the same as Monday the next week, largely. We're now in a world where you've got that element, but also it could all change very quickly. And next week is very different to this week. And there's a certain refreshingness about that, I think, but it's also a little bit of a challenge and a strain, I think, on school leaders.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know whether also it's happening in Northern Ireland, a sort of circuit breaker lockdown, and they're closing their schools for 2 weeks over half term, and it's this sort of problem that might arise with Sadiq Khan talking about London going to the very high restrictions, I think, or at least I don't know now. I do know which one we're on. I think we're on 2 in London. I don't know, but or moving to 2. I don't know. You see, I'm confused.
Yes, I don't know. I've got used to the fact that I find out what's going to be happening in schools by watching the news.
Yeah, is it that bad? Is it?
I remember the good old days where actually the schools would be informed about what they're doing. But now I have to tune into the news to find out. It's a bit like listening to the wireless and finding out what's happening in the wall somewhere. But there's no sort of current. We get lots of current guidance and information, but usually follows after the announcement of what's changing. So yeah, I'm watching a lot more news these days.
Is exams being put back 3 weeks help?
Yes. Well, it helps. Is it enough? Probably not. I am an advocate for going ahead with the exams. And I think if we wanted to think about disadvantage, well, you take exams out, it's going to be the disadvantaged students who are going to suffer the most from that. So it's important that they take place. 3 weeks helps. What helps even more is the adjustments to the content of those exams. If students have had less time in school to study that content, then that content should be changed. And I would be really impressed if exam boards were as quick to react and as flexible as schools have had to be. Because there's a lot of time to plan that content, and some of that content could be changed and taken out. I know some has, but I think that will make the big difference. I don't think necessarily multiple choice answers is it either. That's where it just might as well do a lot. I think my concern would be that when students sit those exams and they get those results, are they going to be considered as something less than the peers that went before? Well, possibly not the peers that went to me no exams, but are we going to be treating them differently? Because of the nature of the exam that they had. It has flagged up just how much weight we put on the examination system and how much is considered to be important about that. And perhaps that's wrong for a start.
Is part of the idea for multiple choice not about helping the student, but perhaps helping the examiner?
Well, I mean, I would argue that, exams are written by examiners, probably for examiners, more than they are for students. I think this is the same thing about universities and academia. If you allow academics to determine the content, then it's going to serve academics and an academic mindset more than it will do the people who are taking it. I think that there is that issue around making it easy for examiners, and I think that has always been the issue. It's been the tail wagging the dog in examination systems for far too long. And what we've seen in this more recently is the exam boards have been far too slow to make any kind of a change or adaptations. And you compare that to what schools have had to do and how many adaptations they've done, really on a really short notice. But the fact that we went through the last exam results fiasco, given the fact that of all the unpredictable things about COVID-19 that we didn't know, one thing we did know was when the exams were going to have been and when the results would be coming out. That sort of thing shouldn't take us by surprise. So I'm pleased at least that we're having a conversation about the exams now in October, not in May or March or April, whichever. That there's some planning going in place, but I would like to see a lot more from the exam boards about how they're making this work and what adaptations they're going to make. And I don't think we've heard all of that yet.
Desmond, it's been a pleasure talking to you this fine morning. The sun is out, and
it's shining where you are, Martin.
It's always shining in southeast London. I know it should be shining over there as well, in the other bit of southeast London, a bit further east, I think. But lovely to talk to you again, and perhaps we'll have you back on at some time. You're never shying coming forward when it comes to being controversial, should we say? Perhaps some people might say.
Yes, I never learned my lesson, Martin.
Thank you very much, Desmond.
Thank you. All the best. Take care.